Hello, LinkedIn, for another episode of the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast, coming to you live here on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and subsequently is going to be on our normal podcast channel as well. Delighted to have two great guys with us today, Peter and Sune. I'll briefly introduce them to you, and then looking forward to a great discussion. So I'll start with Peter. He's the co-founder of Project Aviato, which is an independent investment fund set up to support companies with ideas in transport and in logistics. Prior to setting up Project Aviato, Peter has been within Maersk for many, many years, for 15 years, and in his last job, he was the head of transportation. Peter, great to have you, and thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. And then we have Sune Stilling, who's also the co-founder on the same project, Project Aviato. Sune has also had a long-standing career across many different things, and across many different functions with Maersk for many, many years. And he's one of the people that also pioneered and led Maersk Growth, which is the venture investment arm of Maersk previously. So Sune, pleasure to have you as well, and thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us, Rado.
Before we dig in, as always, people who are watching, do feel free to comment, post your questions on LinkedIn. We will take as many as we can and try to address it. So Peter, Sune, so let's start first and foremost with who you are, a little bit of background, and what brought you to where you are today, launching this amazing project and this amazing investment vehicle. Let's start with Sune. Tell us a little bit about your background, what you did previously. How did you, I know we were just chatting, right? You've done pretty much everything that could be done in a big corporation, in a big shipping company, but tell us about yourself.
No, thanks a lot, Ben. And, I might end up stealing a little bit of Peter's thunder here, but so Peter and I actually joined Maersk at exactly the same time in mid-1999, where we both joined what was back then called Maersk International Shipping Education, which a lot of people, particularly from the slightly older generation, might be familiar with. And then the first, let's say, 10 years with Maersk, I sort of followed a relatively traditional career path, a lot of rotations, different departments, different functions, different countries, parts of the world, working corporate, regional, country levels, and sort of really got let's call a very, very nice introduction to general management. And then in 2008, I decided for family reasons to relocate to West Africa, which sort of sparked another decade or a transition in my career where I got to, let's say, experiment a lot with running organizations as a managing director and CEO of a lot of different organizations. That sort of from around 2012 then led to a stronger focus for me on the energy businesses, so venturing into Maersk energy portfolio, where I ran and restructured a couple of relatively large organizations and was part of divesting of those companies. And then in mid 2016, when Maersk decided to change the strategy and move from being a conglomerate to becoming a focused transportation logistics business, I got the call from Søren Skov, who asked me to undertake or oversee the adjacent growth agenda for Maersk on an enterprise level. And in 2017, I then moved back to Denmark with my family after having been away from headquarters the preceding 12 years or so. And essentially, from early 2017 till the end of 2020, founded and built what is today known as Maersk Growth. The core activity being around venture investing. So we built quite a sizable portfolio, which I'm sure we can talk about a bit later. Done 23, 24 first round investments, another 10 follow-on rounds in startups all over the globe over a 3-year period, but have also been doing some B2B stuff. We are very involved when we incubated TradeLens, that a lot of the audience is probably aware of. We were involved in setting up the Maersk Cold Chain product and a lot of other things in the early days. And then over time, it's sort of become more and more focused on the venture investment part. And and then as you mentioned, then at the end of 2020, Peter and I decided to leave Maersk. Not an easy decision for either of us, but we just felt that that the opportunity that Project Aviato represents, it's so good. It's a one in a lifetime or once in a cycle, as we talk about it, opportunity that we had to go after, and that's, you know, and here we are.
Super. Thanks for that run through. Peter, tell us a little bit. You've been all over the place as well, so yeah, maybe a bit your background.
I think that's also what characterizes Maersk, is it gives you a lot of opportunities very early in your career, and you could say Sune said it right. We started together 21 years ago, and then my career has taken me to several places. I've had kids in 3 different countries. I've tried to lead a growing Balkan region. Spent time in Madrid. Spent time in Eastern Europe. And then latest, you could say, I would say 6 to 8 years has been very much focused around transformation. So on one side, it was initially transforming, you could say, the pricing and optimization model of Maersk, so building a revenue management capability. And then latest, what typically happens is I went and I took my executive MBA at INSEAD and had an amazing time. And of course, that opens all of a sudden a lot of doors, and came back from that. And then I was asked at the time, well, how about you take this transformation? We need to take Maersk to a completely different place. And it fit perfectly into what I had experienced, what I wanted to do, you could say. And then having worked on should we say, moving Maersk from being a conglomerate with an energy business and becoming the end-to-end integrator, has been super exciting, driven the platform operating model, all kinds of super interesting that are going to, it's going to change Maersk for the future to be, and you're already going to start reading something about it. But as Sune says, there comes a time in everyone's personal career, and I think my old former boss, I said this yesterday as well, said, when you go through transformation, it also transforms you. And I could certainly feel that I had a desire to go out and try something on my own. And then Sune and I knew each other very well and saw this opportunity. And here we are. It's super exciting so far. It's only a month and a half in, but it's fun.
No, awesome. So let's go into the present, right? So, and I know that, you know, Project Aviato, once in a cycle. That's what Sune said. That's what you have it on your LinkedIn. Let's talk about that. What is it? Once in a cycle. Tell us more about what you're building.
Do you want to kick that off, Peter?
Yeah, sure. I think it's once in a cycle because it's a space. The supply chain space is an area where you have tech meeting the physical transport. It's an area that hasn't been proliferated to the extent we've seen in earlier cycles. And Sune can talk a lot more to those cycles that have been, you could say, in earlier decades. We really believe that this next decade is about marrying those two and finding an area where we can add value as a growth, you could say, equity fund setup that can go in and identify these areas for improvements in the overall supply chains. And then marrying this experience, you could say, that you need to have understanding the business as an operator, which we both sat in, but also having that leg in the VC world, bringing that into the table, understanding that world and coupling them together. So it's super exciting. I mean, Sune, you can speak for hours and hours on this, I know.
And I probably shouldn't, since this is a 1-hour podcast.
Yes, a few minutes on that. Yes.
I think Peter's exactly right. I mean, when you look sort of at, let's say, the history of venture capital, or when you look at the history of the world, right? I mean, all the way from the Industrial Revolution, and I mean, you know, you got people talking about Industry 4.0 now, and all sorts of things, right? But you know, when you look at just adventure, it's pretty clear, right? I mean, you've had sort of a decade of SaaS businesses where a lot of great companies and a lot of great, you know, investors came from, and we really believe that now we are at that intersect where that, as Peter, you know, aptly describes, right, software and Industry 4.0, including supply chain, that coincides. This, of course, has been accelerated by the COVID pandemic as well. So I think we just believe, and I think we've seen some excellent proof points in the markets of that some of the models that has both the physical capability and the digital low-touch capability, they're right now, they're winning. Conversely, the companies that don't, they're losing. And I think that's becoming evidently clear very fast. So that's essentially what we're looking at, and also why we believe this is a once in in a cycle opportunity, right? I mean, last 10 years, a lot of talk about fintech, and we believe that now is the time for, let's call it logtech, in lack of a better word.
Logtech, yeah. Well, I'll bring into discussion. I posted yesterday, actually. I posted something. I think it was to the line of, there's shipping lines buying planes. There's obviously Amazon has been doing it for a while. There's the question: will Amazon buy a shipping line? There's all these forces that are kind of coinciding on your point of, physical and digital coming together. Let me ask you guys as well this question, right? So, the question that I posted was, with all these forces, and there's a lot of consolidation happening also on the 3PL industry. There's a couple of big deals that have been announced in recent times, and there seems to be a lot of rumors for more to come. How do you see the overall space, right, morphing in the next 3 to 5 years? Just some, I mean, nobody knows, right? Ultimately, only fools make predictions, so I'm the first. But tell us a little bit of how you see, this morphing and all these startups coming together, and how do you see it? How is it going to look like in 5 years, let's say? Peter, let's.
Yeah, no. I mean, for me, I think what's interesting about this industry, and it's also why we're into this space, is I think there is a maturity gap or something that needs to change. There's still a lot of adversarialness in this industry where everybody fights everybody. So this thought process of working in a grander ecosystem and agreeing on a set of standards and setting up a structure around that, and then finding out what is it that we really want to compete on is one of the areas we see. And as you said yourself, there's a lot of movement in the industry right now. I think one of the things you start seeing is a different type of collaboration across the industry that you see in many, many other industries. I think that's going to come our way in the near future. I think it's also a super important step for this industry to take, because the pace of change is catching up to the industry, and you find the incumbents trying to redo and change their entire way of operating. And at the same time, you have these guys coming out who have been in the industry, can see these issues, and start building interesting startups that can plug these holes. So I think it's a super interesting phase we're going into right now. I don't know if you have anything to add, Sune, to that.
I think that the only thing to me is, and I think you're speaking to it as well, Peter, is the whole, thinking around partnerships, right? I think a lot of people, both, let's say, coming from the shipping industry, historically, that's been a very adversarial industry that competes on everything. I think some of these common standards and some of these common initiatives actually means that you create a playing field that may not be level, but actually means that you start competing on the right parameters, and the parameters that actually makes an difference for the industry and a difference for the customers, who I think historically tend to be a little bit forgotten. I mean, discussions tend to be about being the biggest and the best and having the most steel. It's very rarely about, well, actually, what does the customer want and what actually serves the customers, which of course is also then where startup land has been able to create that wedge, right? Because they're coming from a customer centricity, right? And I really think there's a huge thing there that's often overlooked. One thing is the tech capability, and I'm not underestimating that. But I think that just that customer mindset, right? I mean, very clearly, a lot of the companies that we invested in a Maersk growth context, right? They are pushing net promoter scores of 70 and 80. Nobody else in the shipping and logistics industry can dream about that, right? And I think that's a pretty interesting starting point. And then I also think maybe that just the last thing on this with partnerships, that I think there's been a certain dichotomy around saying it's either startup or corporate. We see it slightly differently. We really see a symbiosis rather, right? And we see that nobody can win in this space without each other. So using that scale, the leverage of the corporates and the reach, and then combining that with the let's call it innovative capability or whatever it might be that the startup brings to the table. And I think that's probably where the magic is going to happen going forward.
I'll just echo some of the things that you guys shared. There was one senior executive that commented. You can find the comment yourselves if you go to the post. But so there were a lot of interesting comments, and but this one in particular started. You started me because you said customer centricity, and his comment was, actually nobody gave a damn or gives a damn. Still, in some of these big deals, is more about ego and grandiosity than it is, are we actually helping the clients? Also, obviously, there's some pretty significant economic and financial arbitrage. I'm not going to name companies, but obviously their share prices tends to go upwards if they do it, and they've done it pretty well over and over again. So, but it's not necessarily with having the customer at the forefront. So to your point, right? So that intersection, and that's where, I mean, time and time again, Amazon and Alibaba, and maybe that angle has really focused at a big scale on the customer. Startups, obviously, the same. So I'd like to ask you guys also, how do you? So now you're looking at investing, and you're looking on these interesting ideas. We have a bunch of people listening in that come from that startup ecosystem, or they're founders, or they're wanting to start their own companies. How do you guys look and identify good startups, good idea? What do you look for versus not so great ones?
Well, I think maybe I'll speak a bit to this, right? I mean, Peter has been part of some of the due diligence and some of the many pitches, right? But over, let's say, a 3-year period in a Maersk growth context, a typical month for us would be that we saw around 100 companies invest, supply chain startups on a global scale, and then statistically we ended up investing in one of those, right? So I think we've kissed a lot of frogs. I think it's also pretty clear that my understanding and perception of what does good look like has also changed and probably improved over the last 3-4 years. I think some of the things that certainly still stands, right, is that we were saying at Maersk Growth, and that's also being carried into Aviato, right, that we invest in teams. Right, and this might sound like a little bit of a cliche, but there's clearly something about this, right? That you might have the world's best idea, but if you can't really execute on it, if you don't have the time to support it, right? So you rather support or back a rock star team with a mediocre idea than get a mediocre team with a brilliant idea. And at least when you're speaking at this from an investor perspective, right? And I think certainly one of the things that I've had to learn, and I might sort of be diverging a little bit from the question now, I promise to come back in just a second, but certainly one of the big things that I've had to learn from being a corporate exec to being a venture investor is that in the corporate world, right, we spend 90% of our time talking about all our problems and fixing our bleeders, right? So let's fix our problems, fix our problems. Whereas in the venture world, the bleeders, they're left to bleed, but you actually focus on the upside and on your performers. And I think that at least for me has been sort of quite refreshing, right? So it starts with the team. We want to see a team. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we want to see a team that has sort of the right foundation, right? Then we want to we invest in, or will be investing in what we call tech-enabled business models. So not pure hardware, whatever it is, and not sort of, so we like to marry that let's say the physical movement with the software layer. And then we really, really like to see companies that are addressing real problems, and also problems that probably exist in 2 or 3 or 4 years from now, right? I mean, Peter has been a big part of this. But, we have a lot of respect for what a lot of the incumbents are doing now, coming together about some of the stuff that Peter spoke about before, whether it's nice checks, whether it's trade lanes, whether it's DCSA, to create some industry standards. Now, this also means that long-term, we fundamentally don't believe that there's going to be money or companies to be made of plugging those little holes, right? There's still going to be plenty of friction. There's still going to be plenty of customer problems to fix. But that's essentially the companies we want to go after, that fixes problems or opportunities that we believe will also persist in the future. So that's a little bit of a long spiel for me. I don't know if I forgot something major in that, Peter.
No, I think you hit it on the head. So I don't have anything to add to that.
I wanted to I guess also flip it. So this is what you're looking for, right? Are there any tell signs that it won't work, right? Or maybe you may or may not want to share mistakes that you made, but I like to always ask also, from the battle scars and from things that seemed to be good, and then it turned out to be not so good, right? So what are some of the sharing that you can say on that perspective?
Yeah, that probably falls a bit on me again, as I've had to underwrite all the mistakes we've made. But I think, essentially, right, as mentioned, I think, somebody told me, a while back that it takes a lot of money to train a partner in a VC fund, understood in the way that you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And there's only what, I cannot learn from you telling me about your mistakes. I have to get my own battle scars, right? And of course, we have a fair bit of those, right? And I think there's, of course, a difference between corporate venture and pure play venture to some extent, right? Where, from a pure play perspective, you'll probably argue, well, if you didn't hit it out of the park, then that was a failure, and that becomes relatively binary. When you start adding the strategic angle, it becomes a little bit more complicated. But I think I think some of the biggest mistakes we made, I've made within a Maersk Growth, context, but certainly also in previous life, is that, that I haven't gone with my gut instinct, right? That there's something about that one founder that you just cannot get your head around, right? You really like what you're saying, a little bit like you promote somebody when you're in corporate, or you don't fire somebody when you're in a corporate, and you always end up regretting that, right? And you always end up not pulling the Band-Aid off faster than you should, which again comes back to this logic that I've had to learn in venture, where saying, if somebody's bleeding, you let them bleed. You don't waste time on it. And of course, that's brutal, right? Both from we're not talking bleeding in the physical sense, right? But of course, that's a big mental shift, right? So I think that's definitely one. I think there's a pretty clear case, and Peter and I just been talking about that earlier today. I think a lot of the founders that we've invested in, particularly when they come from outside the industry, they tend to significantly underestimate the movement of physical goods, right? So you're taking this software, your consumer logic, and then you're saying, oh, well, all the guys in supply chain and transportation, they're idiots, and I'm not, so I'm going to fix this. And I think that people who come in with this, they typically end up a certain creek without a paddle, right? And so I think that's also one of the things. Typically, we haven't invested in those companies because that's one of the things we've been a little bit allergic to. We like people who actually understand the industry, or at least understand that they don't understand the industry. I think people coming in with this, oh, well, I know everything because, I did whatever app where you could swipe left or right, or whatever way you swipe, right? And then, oh, let me fix global transportation. I think much more complex problem to fix. And then I think maybe just my last piece on this, then even experienced founders that we've invested in, right? And I think we learned this the hard way as well. Even experienced founders, but certainly also unexperienced founders, think they often tend to underestimate the complexity of corporate sales or the business-to-business sales cycle. And they also tend to overestimate the value of having a proof of concept, right? And who in a corporate can give you a proof of concept for $5,000, $10,000, $25,000? And what's the difference between getting that and then up to having a $1 million recurring revenue contract? And that was a little bit the long way around again, but and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I think those are some of the common themes that we've seen.
No, some great pointers. Yeah, Peter, did you want to?
No, but I think as you said, one of the things that, and it hints a little bit to what Sune is saying, but this falling in love with the idea because we're insiders, so we understand the business, and we say, hey, that's, of course, I can see there's a problem here, and then you neglect to understand, one, are the people in front of you the right people to solve that problem? Because you may love that idea and say, I love this. This is exactly what we need to get done. But if you don't have the right people around the table, it's bound to fail. And I think I found myself falling into that trap on a few occasions. And then you end up spending time trying to compensate for that with those individuals. So you're doing what they should be doing. And I think that never, and you can apply that to many other things in life, also in general leadership. So.
Yeah, and actually, thanks for that, Peter. That actually remind me of, and again, this is a little bit tangential, right? But I think when you start looking at, let's say, the Gartner hype cycle, for instance, right? And I think, most people are nice, most people are curious, right? And I think that's really one of the killers often, right? For, we're experiencing this ourselves now. We are raising a fund, right? And of course, people are very interested. And what we are being told is that the worst, that's the long nose, right? Or the nose that you never get because people are curious and they want to know more, and let's have another meeting and let's talk about this and so on. And I think exactly that same thing applies to startups. And I think particularly when dealing with corporates, right? Because a lot of corporates are very curious. They want to know. I mean, at least in the VC world, you tend to get a pretty firm, a no answer. Then you also know that's a no. I think that's a little bit more binary, right? But corporate people are curious. They want to help, but they operate on very, very different timelines, right? And of course, if you're going in and you're depending on turning over your commercial contract every month, and you're up against a 24-month decision process, and some of these are pretty, some of these, let's say that you want to, as a major retailer, you want to change your TMS, for instance. That's not a decision you make on a Friday afternoon, right? That's very, very deep into the core of the operating system of the company, as an example.
I'll pull this, some great points. I'll pull this question. I don't know if you know Sarah. I think she was with Maersk as well at some point. But anyway, so Sarah sits in Singapore. She's, saying corporate versus structure, combine it in various structures. Startup portion should not be tied into the corporate structure, and then the bureaucracy of the corporate structure. I also started the debate on LinkedIn on that, and how most corporates have so many layers and so many VPs of no and chief idea killer and blah blah blah. So what's your thoughts in terms of what was the best way in terms of in which corporates can still be creative and innovative, right? Corporate, obviously, Maersk Growth is one example, right? Corporate venture arm. There's some other people that claim that you can even do it within the corporate. I mean, we see, as another example that comes to my mind, DHL, they have innovation centers that are kind of acting within DHL, and then they invest in the ideas that work. To this, Sarah's pointer, I guess, what's your thoughts?
Well, obviously I agree in the statement, because there is this inherent muscle inside a standing organization to kill anything that's new and different. Because exactly for all the points you just highlighted, this thing that you and we've talked about this many times, Sune and I, that you're venturing into spaces that for the overall company are bleep, right? It means nothing to them. So if it's a rounding error on their weekly report, right? And to give the space and to give the piece to go out and build something, and most importantly, the leadership support and cover. And that's also why you could say Maersk Growth was set up as it was. Initially, it was Søren said to Sune, I'm going to give you air cover. Don't worry, nobody's going to come bother you. You can do what you need to do. That is extremely important to be able to be successful in this type of setup. And then you could say it's identifying quickly these who say no. Find out how do you maneuver around them? How do you find corporate sponsors? And you could say in our former relationship, I was on the corporate side and Sune was the cool kid over in the corporate venture side. And we were, you could say, allies in the sense that there was a way in for Sune into the corporate world, and I could go get inspiration when I needed a breath of fresh air on the CVC side. And I think that if you can find the right individuals who can help push some of these ideas and give space, there's a huge opportunity to make a difference. But it starts with the top and leadership understanding and buying into this and giving the space.
And I think my addition to that, and then maybe just other than clarifying, I'm still cool, but now Peter's also cool. I think the point being that, and I think Peter's absolutely right, but there's also that aspect of what is it you want to achieve, right? And I think in your post on LinkedIn, rather, right, you spoke about disruption, industry disruption, and I think that I think there's often something about the semantics in that, right? Saying what is industry disruption, and I remember had a few conversations with a few notables around this, and I'm not going to elaborate further on that here, but when does it become incremental and when does it become disruptive? And I actually think that a lot of corporates also inside the mothership are good at the incremental innovation. I think, what Maersk is doing on the technical side, on the vessels, and then, now just on they announced earlier today that they're going to, have a carbon neutral container ship on the seas in 2023. I mean, that's absolutely brilliant, right? And so from an innovation perspective, I think that's fantastic. Will it disrupt the industry? Maybe not, right? But I think there's a need sort of to understand sort of what are those two separate things, right? And I think you can do, and probably with some benefit within the core of the business. I think disrupting the business, I think that's more difficult, and I think that's probably better done from the outside.
No, thanks for bringing that up, Sune, and spot on. I'll bring a fairly controversial question to a certain degree, but I'll throw it at you. I think it's something that needs to be addressed because there's also an over-index on ideas. But anyway, so let me see what you think, right? So Mauricio is asking, odd question, risk assessment, do venture capitalists steal startup ideas to give to their portfolios? How to counter? So I guess the question is, you talk to a startup, then you like the idea, but you give it to one of your portfolio companies. Okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be as a VC. I guess there's also the idea that somebody can steal your idea, right? So I've been asked to sign NDAs. I'm sure you guys are asked to sign NDAs, and it's like, but have you done anything? Oh, I have an idea in my mind. Well, that's not really, doesn't really qualify as IP. But anyways, so what do you think on this point?
I'll be happy to speak a bit to that, right? And I think, to me, the starting point is no. I don't believe that VCs steal ideas and corporates steal ideas. I think if they do, they'll get away with it once. Right. So I think in terms of strategy, I think that's extremely short-sighted. Right. And so I'm not saying that has never happened and not saying it will never happen. But I think as a starting point, no. I think the environment and the partnerships that we're engaged in, they are very open source. I've experienced very, very few times that somebody has asked me to sign an NDA. And typically my response to that have been, we'll be happy to sign an NDA, but my best guess is you're going to get more out of talking to me than I am going to get out of talking to you. So, so just remember that if we sign an NDA, it's 2 ways. And this is not to be arrogant. I just think that it's a fact that we just see so much more, right? So, you come with your company, but we've seen 20 companies just like it. So we can tell you what we think is brilliant and why, and what's not so brilliant and why. Right. And of course, the moment that sort of, we on it, and of course, it's not sitting and saying, oh, you should take this tech from this guy. I think what I am seeing and where I think this is relevant, right, is, and again, this comes back to this thinking about partnerships, right? And if this industry has to move forward, some of us has to start getting off the fence, right? If you're constantly getting up not to lose, right, then nothing is going to happen, right? And Peter and I have also been part of endless projects, where we've been sitting for 12 months and discussing IP, who owns the IP if this becomes a success? Saying, well, maybe we should just focus on making it a success, then we can argue about the IP afterwards, right? And then I think that it's just a different mindset. But I must say, I think the one thing where I've seen this being relevant is that I think, and we've had these experiences before as well. We invest in a certain company, right? And let's say that we've invested in this company because of the team and then because they have a brilliant algorithm doing something, right? And the founding team have spent the last 4 years developing that algorithm. So we go in, we invest in the company, and now we own, 11% of this, right? And then, of course, most corporates, they're used to owning, they like control, and they're going to say, wonderful, now tell them to hand over the algorithm. I was like, but that's the whole company. No, I'm not going to ask for that, right? And I think the point being, I think that often startups and corporates, they speak in a different language, right? And they come from a different experiential learning. And therefore, I think there is actually that need, corporate VC, right? I think one of my ex-colleagues in Maersk Growth used to explain this very well, that he kind of saw us as this gearbox between the external world and then Maersk proper, that used at different speeds and, spoken in different terms, right? And I think that's sometimes where you see this. And again, I actually don't think it's out of ill intent. I think it's just a different experience base altogether.
Yep.
So I would not, if the question was, that now I forgot his name, but if he has a brilliant idea, I would not be afraid to go out and start speaking with VCs, right? I mean, the alternative is that you keep, your idea under your pillow, and then in 30 years, probably somebody else has done it, right?
Yeah, definitely don't wait. No, I on a personal note, I could not agree more. I'm going to blow a little bit my own trumpet here, but I'll share the story with the vaccines. We just did a vaccine summit, and the reason why we did it, well, to be honest, we've never done events before. I mean, we started last year because people kept asking us to do events, and then we did one in 2 months, and then we did another one. And then this vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, everybody was talking about it in mid-December. So what I did from idea to implementation, right? And it's not just us, but it's all the sponsors and all the different friends and all the network that encourage us to do. And then they said, look, you should do it because everybody's talking. It's a huge problem that the whole industry has. Go and do it. And I said, okay, fine, let's do it. Right? So let's find a sponsor. So we put it together literally in 4 or 5 weeks. It ended up being a great success. To your point with who owns the IP, who we partnered with some really great cool logistics. They've done events before, but it's more on perishables, right? Rachel White, amazing team. We didn't even sign a contract. We just said, look, Rachel, we have this idea. You have a lot of context and all. Let's just do it, right? We figured out a way also to share, obviously, the revenue. It turned out to be quite good, right? So to that point of, I think it's so important. Let's just get shit done and forget. I mean, obviously now if you're talking MERS versus CMA, I mean, they should get some, stuff in writing and all of that, right? It's not, we're a small fly compared to this, but the focus should be on doing more than, okay, let's chit chat for 2 years and then nothing gets done. So I cannot support that point more, Sune, and thanks for making it. Let me pull this question, which is spot on. I literally had today a discussion on this. So Rune, maybe you guys know him, I'm not sure. So what is
from our batch?
Sorry?
He's from the same year as we are.
Oh, really? All right. So I think he's trying to embrace you.
I think we refuse to answer any question asked by him.
Ah, okay. Sorry, let me take that.
No, it's a joke.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so very good question. Yeah. Key skills that you find lacking, right? So, financial understanding, basic business skill experiments. Well, today the topic that I was discussing, especially on this, was sales skills actually, and storytelling and properly explaining your idea to the investor and the CEO. So, anyways, is there on this topic, Peter? Maybe let's start with you. Is there some let's say commonalities that you see missing?
But I think the commonalities, it depends on where the company is in its stage, right? So depending on when you go in, it's very different if you go pre-seed versus you go Series B on what they need to propel their business going forward. So it's difficult to say that it's one piece, because if you're scaling, you need a different set of competencies. You need to know how to run the business. How do you start building a going concern? Whereas initially, when you're in pre-seed, seed stage, you go in and we talk about sales, is going to market. How do I get it out there? How to open up new markets? How do I make this a success? So it really depends on what stage the company is in and what it is they're trying to tap into. And Sune has done much more and many more of these than I do. So you've probably seen even further than what I've seen.
So very good point, Peter. Maybe let's break it down, right? So maybe it's going to be more than 2 categories, but let's just talk briefly about pre-seed starting, right? Let's start, and then once you've already started to raise the
maybe I'll speak a bit to that. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. I don't know whether it's just me, but so I think let's start with that timeline that you're both talking about, right? Sort of from early stage to slightly later. Then we can always argue whether we cut that off at A or B, right? But I think it's pretty clear that in the early parts of the company, right? And I think we should just keep in mind that this has implications both for the team, management, founders, but certainly also I think for the board level, which I think is often actually overlooked. in venture at least. But when you look at the early stage, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff that we've actually been in help with is like, how do you hire, right? And you should hire some people that are not like yourself, and maybe it's about time you get somebody who takes care of these contracts, because if you end up as a founder, right, and you're a techie, you're spending all your time on the recruitment, that's not really what we want you to be doing, right? So I think there's definitely some of that stuff in the early part, just that whole team formation, and probably pretty HR heavy. There's also some stuff around strategy and things like that. Let's say the 101 of corporate, right? That when you've been in corporate for a while, you know this pretty well. I think what's particularly interesting, and also I think relevant for us in Aviato, and where I think our skill set plays in a little bit better, and is then in some of the later series, where I think the two main things that we really come across from, let's say, a functional perspective, is as you're speaking to, Rado, there's the sales, understanding how do you actually run a professional sales setup that scales, so you don't end up being reliant on the founder selling everything and being the only person who can sell, right? So how do you actually run a sales funnel, particularly in the B2B space? And this is everything from your lead generation to closing stuff and things like that. And there's a very, very big transition typically from a company in the early stages to that. Then the other big transition, which is also where we really lean in to help a lot, is around finance. And when I say finance, it's not about the accounting. I think, like a lot of other things, I think accounting is pretty commoditized, but understanding the implications on growing your business on your cash flow, right? I mean, there's at the older days, right, that it's not, I mean, it's not your EBIT or your profit that kills businesses, right? It's your cash flow. And that's actually surprising for us. There's quite a few founders that are struggling with this. And then, suddenly they're like, oh, we're growing. And we're kind of like, yeah, but, watch this line. You just gave your customers 30 days credit. And by the way, you also gave your suppliers 30 days credit. What's the implications of that cash cycle when you're now not turning over $10 million, but $100, $200, $300 million? What's your implication of your sales cycle not being a month, but 12 months, 18 months? So, that cash logic, right? That's the two functional areas where we typically have stepped in the most in the later stage, where, as mentioned in the earlier stage, it's more about the HR aspects and sort of, helping with some of the more basics. What does an organization actually look like, right? Mm-hmm. So I think those are the two that stands out to me. And then obviously every organization should have a Rune Sørensen on their team.
A what?
Rune, who asked the question. Everybody should have somebody like that.
Sorry. There you go. So let me where is Rune? Just a second. So everybody, please find Rune on LinkedIn. Look him up. He will be in very high demand after this. But, Rune, if you're still watching, do up your salary fees and all of that. But Rune is the guy. So you've heard it from Sune and from Peter.
You're welcome.
Here's another top question. So Peter, I've been following Peter for a while. He's the founder of a startup. Maybe you guys know him. How inflated are valuations today? Are tens of millions really needed to build team and technology? In his company, they don't have VC money. We actually develop a lot, so I have difficult time understanding how this works in VC-backed companies. While you get the ideas, okay, I think he means that sometimes they get too much money and then, they spend it on the wrong things. And do you actually always, there's a balance, right? Do you actually need VC money? Don't you need? How do you kind of, balance all of these options, I guess?
I can just while you're reading the question, I quickly looked Peter up, and I can see he's like me. He's in an Andalusia. But other than that, I actually don't know his company. But I'll have to look into that. I think clearly venture capitalist is a choice, right? So, how do you grow your company, right? And there's, of course, that's there. What does the financial structure of your company look like, right? I mean, are you able to bootstrap it? You do debt finance it? Do you equity finance it, right? And that's a choice, like in any other company. What does your capital structure look like, right? Typically keeping in mind that some of the companies, at least the one we've been invested in, are not let's say, typical loan cases in a bank, because a lot of it is vision, right? And then, you know, we spoke about pre-seed, seed, all that stuff, pre-revenue. You have a company, how do you actually finance that unless you have a rich uncle, right? So I think there's a choice around that. Now, this doesn't mean that venture is the right answer to any company, right? And I think there's a lot of very, very good companies being built, including in supply chain, that doesn't take on any third-party capital, neither equity nor debt, and I think that's perfectly fine, right? I think what we are seeing, of course, with venture is that, you know, we are going in, and that's the financial aspect. We also believe, particularly in Aviato, there's a very, very huge non-financial aspect to this, a value creation perspective. But you are essentially going in and you're underwriting some of the risk, or you're helping the company, you know, undertake some of that burden. And in return, you know, if it goes wrong, okay, you know, we can still be friends. And if it goes well, you know, everybody's going to make a lot of money. That's sort of is, let's say, that a little bit very simplified, the handshake in venture, right? And you know, and I think it's just really a matter of finding for your company, finding the right capital structure. What are your ambitions? And, you know, how fast and how big do you want to grow your company? And that differs. It differs from company to company, different from founder to founder, right? And you know, so that I don't really sort of think I can say a lot more about that, right? That maybe for Peter and Freightander, that's perfect that they never taken on venture capital, right? It might also have been a huge mistake. I don't know. And then you also have, and I think there's also the question about valuation. Sorry, that I just reminded myself of. There are clearly a lot of companies out there that carry excessive valuations. I think one of the good things that we are seeing with, and Peter and I also spoke about that earlier this morning, one of the good things I think we're seeing about the COVID pandemic, right, that they're keeping in mind that when you go in and you invest in a venture case, right, you invest in part fundamentals and part, let's say, vision or ambition. And some investors and in some geographies, they lean more towards the vision. And that's why, you know, typically out of the Bay Area, you see some pretty lofty valuations. That's because investors on the West Coast tend to be more focused on the vision. And I think sort of the further east you go, and I'll stop with east in Europe, right? But even on the US East Coast, but particularly in Europe, investors are more focused on the fundamentals, right? And cash flows are at a premium. I think one of the things we've really seen the last, you know, let's say last 12 months, 18 months with the COVID pandemic is that most investors are beginning to put a premium on cash flows. So they're focusing a little bit more on fundamentals and a little bit less on vision. But of course, vision is still a very big part of the premium. Also, typically, you end up paying a multiplier for a future cash flow or for future recurring revenue, right? So that's one aspect. I think the other one about valuation is that we are beginning to see now, because of the COVID pandemic, that these companies that I spoke about earlier, that has both a physical delivery model and a digital delivery model, and make those two intersect, they are now performing incredibly well, right? Conversely, there are companies that said, oh, well, look, in 3 years and 5 years, we'll be this. Now these 3 years have suddenly been fast forwarded. And now it turns out that they're not wearing any clothes, right? And those companies, of course, are gonna crash and burn. But you know, clearly, some companies have way too high valuations, and that's a kiss of death, essentially. But I think it's not. You know, is there a bubble in some spaces? Absolutely. In some spaces, I don't think so. I think actually there's still some very, very good companies out there that are trading at I think, you know, very, very reasonable prices compared to what they can be worth.
So let's build upon that, Peter. Let me ask you. So how do you guys, right? So now you've started 8 weeks. How do you find these, you know, nuggets, these, you know, great teams, these great ideas, these great startups? I mean, I can imagine, you know, I don't even activate in this, and then I get some hits by startups saying, hey, can you do a podcast? Can you promote our product? Is the best. Now I can only think that you guys are getting hundreds more, right? So how do you sift through, I guess, right? And kind of, you know, what's your mechanism for spotting the gems?
And you can say that's the really positive side about now our third partner is not on this call, but Peter and Sune bringing an established process, you could say, from Maersk Growth on how do you go through. I mean, Sune mentioned 100 companies a month turning into one opportunity. That's a lot to sift through. So I think having a clearly established process on these are the companies that are coming in. This is how we evaluate them. They go to investment committee, and you follow that. That allows you to gain access, understand, and filter out what is done. Do you filter out some that turn out to be good? Yes, of course you do sometimes. But I think it's having an ingrained process. Secondly, I mean, the simple fact that we have webinars like this, that we announce these things on LinkedIn has, as you said, resulted in a huge influx of deals. And then finally, and I think most importantly, this area is around building relationships. And I think part of what Maersk Growth and Sune and the team have done exceptionally well, and Sune, of course, you can add to this, is build those relationships with other VC partners in this space, both in the US and around Europe. So there's an interest of working together and identifying these opportunities, and then either partnering up and investing in them together. But in essence, it's also about getting out there. And then also, you talked about it a little bit before, Sune, this value creation piece is simply alpha and omega. The second they see that we're someone who can come in and bring value to the table, that starts spreading rapidly. So if they've had a good experience with working with Maersk Growth or working with the individuals here, they would also say the next time someone's asking them, hey, you went into the bed with them, were they good? Did they help you? Did they actually provide value? And I think that's also part of what we're using in Aviato. We're putting that in the bottle, right? We have it as an established process that we can lay out and push to the companies that we invest in. And that also creates a funnel of opportunities that keeps coming back. And then obviously when we've raised fund 5, 10, 15, will be such an important powerhouse, you could say, that they have to come to us and want to come to us because we provide value to them. That was a little bit down the road, but that's how we see it.
I mean, it's snowball effect, right? So it builds over time. And obviously, you know Rune, so Rune helps you a lot, right, as well. So let's not forget, your Rune's friend. So bringing back Rune for, his value has gone up a little bit more, but I'll use it as a recurring theme. Awesome. Sune, did you want to add anything to that, or? Oh, I think you're on. Something happened. We can't hear you, Sune. Oh,
you're actually unmuted. Your quota for talking.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah. No, yes. Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Wow. Okay. Great. I'm back then. I think Peter covered that. I think he covered that well, right? I think that element of social capital, right? I think that when you look at the venture community, whether on the fund side or whether on the startup side, you kind of have to earn your right? And I mean, it's a little bit, I don't know, if you join a new football team, right? You might have all your credentials from somewhere else, but that does mean that you're in the starting 11, and we work very hard for a number of years on sort of earning that right, and you kind of find out, what is it that you're good at and what do you bring to the party, right? And I mean, let's be frank, right? I mean, if we were gonna invest in biotech, right, we wouldn't stand a chance because we have no claim for that space. Now we just happen to understand the supply chain space incredibly well, both from Peter's experience with the core business, what I've been doing both with Maersk Growth and before that, and with the other Peter, his experience, and then we have some other people joining us over time as well, right? And I think it's really coming in that we do supply chain. That's what we do, right? We don't do dating apps, we don't do all sorts of. That's the only thing I could think of, dating apps. But
well, Bumble is a good, it's a good story, so I think it's hard not to think of it. No, but that's awesome. I mean, that's some great examples, and spot on, right? And obviously everybody has to work for the right to play, like you rightfully said, and spot on. We have a lot more questions, but I'll take you separately. I'll take you offline as well. It's been a pleasure, guys. Really a pleasure. thanks for all the sharing. Great, great and good luck in the journey ahead. I want everybody that will hear this, see this, as well as do interact with Peter, do write to Sune, connect to them at least, and follow the good work that they do at Project Aviato, and keep an eye for them. If you have an idea, obviously I don't need to tell you. If you're a good entrepreneur, go pitch them. Hopefully they'll reply. Make sure that it's a smart pitch. And guys, all the best. It's been a pleasure. Great having you. And maybe we do one more in 1 year, and we see what you cooked in the meantime.
That'd be fantastic. Thanks a lot for having us, and thanks for listening, everyone. I'll go and buy some shares in Rune Sørensen now.
Take care, guys.
Take care.